The coffee had gone cold 3 hours ago. Lieutenant Priya Menon sat in her chair aboard the deep space monitoring station called the Vigilance, staring at the same screen she'd been staring at for the last 14 months. Nothing ever changed out here. The station floated past the edge of the Kuiper Belt, so far from the sun that the star looked like just another bright dot among millions. Her job was to watch, to listen, to wait for something that most people on Earth believed would never come. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway. It tasted terrible, but it was better than nothing. The station had a crew of 9 people floating in the most remote place any human had ever lived, doing the most boring job in the entire solar system. Her screen showed the usual data: gravity readings, radiation levels, electromagnetic signals from distant stars, all normal, all exactly the same as yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. Then the numbers changed. Priya blinked. She set down her coffee and leaned forward. The gravity sensors were picking up something strange. A disturbance. Not one object, but many. Hundreds. Then thousands. The readings kept climbing, and the pattern was wrong. Natural objects did not move like this. Asteroids did not arrive in formation. Comets did not drop out of faster-than-light travel in coordinated waves. Her hands started to shake. She ran the numbers again, then a third time. The computer confirmed what her eyes were telling her, and her stomach turned to ice. Over 4,000 objects had just appeared at the edge of the solar system. They were large. They were moving fast. And they were coming inward, toward the sun, toward the planets, toward Earth. Priya hit the emergency transmission button so hard she cracked the plastic cover. Solcom Command, this is Vigilance Station, Priority Omega. I am detecting over 4,000 unidentified mass signatures entering the solar system in coordinated formation. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The signal would take hours to reach Earth at the speed of light, but it would not need to. Humanity had built relay stations across the solar system for exactly this reason. The message bounced from one hidden transmitter to the next, hopping across billions of kilometers in minutes. By the time Priya had finished her second transmission, the message was already arriving at Solcom Command in Geneva. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Switzerland when the world changed. Fleet Admiral Konstantin Voronov was eating a sandwich in his office when his personal terminal began screaming. He put the sandwich down slowly, wiped his hands on a napkin, and read the message. He read it twice. Then he picked up his phone and called the war room. This is Voronov. Activate Protocol Prometheus. All stations, all fleets, all assets. This is not a drill. He said it the same way he might have ordered lunch. Calm, flat, controlled. The people who knew Voronov understood that this was exactly when he was most dangerous. The man did not panic. He had spent 40 years in the military and the last 15 preparing for this exact moment. Every simulation, every war game, every sleepless night spent studying alien technology recovered from crashed probes and refugee ships had led to this Tuesday afternoon. Within 1 hour, the war room was full. Admirals, generals, intelligence officers, and civilian leaders crowded around the massive holographic display that showed the entire solar system. The enemy fleet appeared as a cloud of red dots beyond Neptune, moving steadily inward. 4,200 ships, said Commander Lena Okafor, Voronov's chief intelligence officer. She was a tall woman with sharp eyes and a voice that cut through noise like a blade. Formation is consistent with Vreth Dominion, standard invasion patterns. Pyramid structure, heavy ships at the core, screening vessels on the flanks. The room went quiet at the name, the Vreth Dominion. Everyone in that room knew the name. When 80 years ago, a small, damaged alien ship had crashed on the dark side of the moon. Inside were 3 survivors of a species called the Telleri. They were refugees, the last of their kind. The Vreth had destroyed their homeworld, just as they had destroyed hundreds of others. The Telleri had lived for 6 years in a secret facility before they died. In that time, they told humanity everything. They described the Vreth Dominion, an empire that stretched across 1,000 star systems. They described the Vreth method: find a species, study it from a distance, determine that it was too primitive to resist, then send an armada, conquer the planet, enslave the population, or, if the species was deemed too troublesome, simply wipe it out. The Talari had warned humanity with their dying breaths. The Vreth would come. They always came. It was only a matter of time, and so humanity had prepared. The world had not been told everything. The average person on Earth knew that aliens existed. They knew that first contact had been made decades ago. But they did not know the full extent of what had been built in the dark, cold spaces between planets. They did not know about the weapons hidden in the asteroid belt, the fleets constructed inside hollowed-out moons, the sensor networks woven through the outer solar system like an invisible spiderweb. They did not know about the 80 years of quiet, obsessive, paranoid preparation that had consumed the resources of every nation on Earth, all working together in secret for the first time in human history. Voronov looked at the red dots on the display and felt nothing. Not fear, not excitement, just a cold, hard focus, white like a lens clicking into place. "What do we know about their commander?" he asked. Okafor pulled up a file. "Based on fleet composition and communication intercepts, we believe the Armada is commanded by Grand Admiral Zarak, known as Zarak the Unbroken. He has led over 40 planetary conquests for the Dominion. He has never lost." "He has never fought us," Voronov said quietly. On the other side of the solar system, aboard the massive flagship called the Throne of Silence, Grand Admiral Zarak was holding a briefing of his own. The Vreth were tall beings, nearly 3 meters in height, with 4 arms and skin like dark blue stone. Their eyes were black and showed no white. Zarak stood at the center of his command deck, surrounded by his senior officers, and he looked at the holographic image of the small blue planet they had come to claim. "Earth," he said. The translator in his throat turned the word into clicks and hisses. "Third planet from the local star. Population approximately 12 billion. Dominant species is mammalian, carbon-based, unremarkable." His first officer, a scarred veteran named Talek, studied the tactical data with visible boredom. "Technology assessment? Primitive," said the intelligence officer. "Chemical propulsion rockets, basic orbital stations, no detected energy shielding, no faster-than-light capability, no directed energy weapons. They have spread to their nearest neighbor planet in small numbers, a colony of approximately 2 million on the 4th planet." Tulloch made a sound that was the Vreth equivalent of a laugh. "We brought 4,000 ships for this? A single battle group would be enough." "The Dominion does not take chances," Zarak said, but even he felt that this was excessive. He had conquered species with warp drives and orbital defense grids, using a fraction of this force. These humans, with their chemical rockets and fragile space stations, would fold like paper. "Time to the inner system?" he asked. "At current speed, we will reach the 4th planet in 6 days, the 3rd planet in 7. "Good. Begin standard approach. Deploy forward scouts. Open communication channels when we reach their detection range. Offer the standard terms: surrender or destruction." His officers saluted and returned to their stations. Zarak remained at the center of the deck, looking at the image of Earth. It was a pretty world, he admitted to himself. Blue and white and green. It would make a fine addition to the Dominion, or a fine ruin, if the inhabitants chose to be difficult. He did not expect them to be difficult. Back on Earth, Voronov stood before the United Nations Solar Defense Council in an emergency session. World leaders appeared on screens from every continent. Some looked terrified, some looked angry, a few looked like they might be sick. "The situation is as follows," Voronov said, his voice filling the chamber. "An alien fleet of over 4,000 warships has entered our solar system. Based on all available intelligence, this is a Vreth Dominion invasion force. Their intent is conquest or extermination." The room erupted. Voices shouted over each other. The president of Brazil demanded to know how this was possible. The prime minister of India asked about evacuation, as the Chinese premier asked how long they had. Voronov waited for the noise to stop. It took 2 full minutes. When the room was quiet again, he spoke. "We have prepared for this for 80 years. Every weapon system, every fleet, every defense platform that we have built in secret is now being activated. The enemy does not know what we have. They believe we are a primitive species with no real military capability. They are wrong." He paused and looked around the room, meeting every pair of eyes. They will enter our solar system expecting an easy conquest. They will find something very different. But I will not lie to you. This will not be clean. This will not be easy. We will lose ships. We will lose people. Some of you will need to make terrible decisions in the coming days. Yep, but I want every person in this room to understand one thing. He placed his hands flat on the table. We are not the Telari. We are not the 100 species the Freth have crushed before us. We have had 80 years to study their tactics, their technology, and their weaknesses. We know how they fight. We know how they think. And we have built things they cannot imagine. The room was silent now. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of people listening very carefully. Voronov turned to the holographic display. The red dots of the enemy fleet were creeping inward, past the orbit of Neptune. I need full authorization to execute the defense plan as designed. All phases. No political interference, no second guessing. What the military chain of command must be clear and unbroken from this moment until the threat is eliminated. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in human history, every nation on Earth agreed on the same thing at the same time. In the days that followed, the solar system came alive in ways the Vreth could not see. Deep in the asteroid belt, massive doors opened on the surfaces of rocks that had been hollowed out decades ago, and warships slid into the darkness, running cold, emitting nothing. Around Jupiter, carrier groups powered up in the shadow of the gas giants' crushing radiation belts, where no alien sensor could reach. On Mars, the underground cities sealed their blast doors, and the colonists were told the truth. All 2 million of them. And in the outer solar system, stretching from Neptune to beyond the orbit of Uranus, the outer defense network woke up. Thousands of platforms, each one no larger than a car, each one coated in sensor-absorbing material, each one carrying enough weapons to kill a warship. They had been sleeping for decades, drifting in the cold and the dark, waiting for the signal. The signal came. Priya Menon, still aboard the Vigilance, watched her screens as the defense network activated. Tiny blue dots appeared across her display, spreading out in a vast web. She had always known they were there, but seeing them wake up was something else entirely. It was like watching a sleeping giant open its eyes. She sent one more message to Solcom. Vigilance Station reporting. Enemy fleet continues inward approach, no change in formation. ODN is active and tracking. They don't see us, nor they don't see any of it. Voronov received the message in the war room. He read it aloud to his staff. Then he looked at the display, at the 4,000 red dots moving with the confidence of a predator that had never known fear, and he allowed himself the smallest of smiles. Let them come deeper, he said. Okafor stood beside him, her arms crossed. How deep? Deep enough that when we close the door behind them, they cannot get out. Outside, the stars were cold and silent. The Vreth Armada moved through the darkness, formation perfect, weapons charged, every officer aboard every ship absolutely certain that they were sailing toward another easy victory, another primitive world to add to the Dominion's collection. They did not know that they were being watched by 10,000 hidden eyes. They did not know that the empty space around them was filled with weapons. They did not know that every kilometer they traveled brought them deeper into a trap that had been built with 80 years of human fear, human anger, and human determination. They did not know that they were already dead. They just had not found out yet. On the throne of silence, Xeric retired to his private quarters. He poured himself a drink, a dark liquid that burned pleasantly, and he looked out the viewport at the distant yellow star that the humans called the sun. Such a small, ordinary star. Such a small, ordinary system. He finished his drink and went to sleep. It would be the last peaceful night of his life. The first probe vanished on the second day. It was a small thing, barely worth noticing. Unless the Vreth routinely sent scout probes ahead of their fleets during any advance. These were fast, expendable machines designed to map the space ahead and report back. They had been using the same model for centuries. They were reliable. Probe 16 sent its last transmission from a point between the orbits of Neptune and Uranus. The data showed nothing unusual. Empty space, background radiation, dust. Then the signal simply stopped. No distress call, no damage report. It was just gone. The sensor officer aboard the Throne of Silence noted the loss in his log and sent a replacement. Probes failed sometimes. It happened. Space was full of micro debris that could destroy a small machine. Nobody thought twice about it. Then probe 22 vanished, then probe 31, then 4 more in the same hour. Now the sensor officer was paying attention. He pulled up the trajectory data and studied it carefully. The probes had all been lost in the same general area, a wide band of space that the fleet would be passing through within hours. He reported it to the first officer, Talek, who frowned at the data with all 4 of his arms crossed. "Debris field?" Talek asked. "Possible, first officer, but the pattern is unusual. The losses are spread across a very wide area. A natural debris field would be more concentrated. Run a deep scan of the area ahead." The sensor officer did as he was told. The deep scan came back clean. Nothing out there, just empty space, cold and dark and silent. Talek dismissed the issue. "Increase the probe deployment rate, replace what we have lost. Note the anomaly in the log." He did not report it to Grand Admiral Zurich. It was beneath the Grand Admiral's attention. Probes failed. That was the nature of space, but the probes kept failing. By the end of the 3rd day, the Vreth had lost 47 forward probes. The sensor officer was now visibly nervous. He had mapped the locations of every loss, and the pattern was unmistakable. The failures formed a rough sphere around the fleet's projected path, as though something was deliberately clearing the eyes and ears ahead of the Armada. He reported this to Talek again. This time, Talek brought it to Zerug. The Grand Admiral stood at the tactical display and studied the map of lost probes. His dark eyes moved slowly across the data points. The bridge was quiet around him. Officers worked at their stations, but several were glancing at their commander, waiting for his reaction. "Your assessment?" Zerug asked the sensor officer. "Grand Admiral, I cannot explain the losses through natural causes. The pattern suggests deliberate action. Something is destroying our probes." "Something? Be specific." The sensor officer hesitated. "I cannot be specific, Grand Admiral. Our deep scans show nothing. No ships, no stations, no weapons platforms, no mines, nothing. But the probes are being destroyed." Zerug considered this. In his long career, he had encountered many surprises. Some species hid mines in their outer systems. Others deployed automated defense drones. All of them had been minor obstacles, swept aside by the weight of a Vreth Armada. Whatever the humans had placed out here, it would be the same. "Continue the advance, Wertai," he ordered. "Deploy heavier probes with armor plating, and increase the scanning frequency on all sensor arrays." The fleet moved deeper into the solar system. The armored probes lasted slightly longer than their predecessors, but they too began to vanish. And now something new was happening. The fleet's own communication buoys, dropped behind the Armada to maintain contact with the Dominion, were also going silent. One by one, the links in the chain were breaking. Zerug noticed this but said nothing. He stood at the center of his bridge like a statue, watching the tactical display with an expression that revealed nothing. Inside, for the first time in many years, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not yet, but a whisper of uncertainty, like a cold draft in a warm room. 8 billion kilometers away, in the war room beneath Geneva, Voronov was watching the same situation from the other side. "ODN reports all sectors active," said Commander Okafor, reading from her terminal. "Enemy probe neutralization rate is at 94%. Their heavy probes are taking slightly longer to kill, but the platforms are adapting. The enemy fleet has not altered course or formation." Voronov nodded. The outer defense network was performing exactly as designed. The platforms were small, cold, and invisible to Vreth sensors. They operated autonomously, communicating with each other through tight beam laser links that were impossible to detect unless you were standing directly in the path. When a Vreth probe entered their zone, they killed it quietly and efficiently, using focused microwave bursts that fried the probe's electronics without leaving debris that might be detected. The platforms were not powerful enough to threaten warships. They were never meant to be. Their job was to blind the enemy, to strip away their ability to see what was ahead and behind, and they were doing that job perfectly. "What about the torpedo swarms?" Voronov asked. Okafor pulled up another display. "All 14 swarm packages are on intercept trajectories. First contact in approximately 9 hours. The torpedo swarms were something different entirely. They had been launched years ago, fired from hidden platforms throughout the outer solar system on slow, cold trajectories that would bring them into the path of any fleet approaching from the expected direction. They carried no engines. They emitted nothing. They were just dead metal, falling through space on carefully calculated paths, waiting for the moment when an enemy fleet would pass close enough. Each swarm consisted of hundreds of individual warheads, spread across thousands of kilometers. They were too small to appear on any sensor. They were too cold to show a heat signature. They were, for all practical purposes, invisible. And they were aimed at the back of the Vreth fleet. The first swarm made contact at 0347 hours, Geneva time. Aboard the Vreth destroyer, Crimson Edge, stationed at the rear of the formation, the night watch was quiet. The ship was running on standard alert, which for the Vreth meant that half the crew was resting while the other half monitored systems that showed nothing interesting. The Crimson Edge was an older vessel, assigned to the unglamorous job of guarding the fleet's tail. Nothing ever happened at the back of a Vreth formation. Only the warhead struck the Crimson Edge at a relative velocity of 12 kilometers per second. It hit the ship's lower hull, punching through the outer armor like a needle through cloth. The shaped charge inside detonated a microsecond later, sending a jet of superheated metal through the ship's interior. The reactor containment failed. The Crimson Edge became a brief, bright flash of light, and then it was nothing at all. 412 Vreth crew members died without knowing they were under attack. Across the rear echelon of the fleet, it happened again, and again, and again. The swarm warheads found their targets with patient, mechanical precision. They did not miss. They did not hesitate. They were not alive, and they felt nothing about what they were doing. In the first wave, 31 ships were destroyed, not damaged. They destroyed. They simply ceased to exist, replaced by expanding clouds of debris and cooling gas. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, the first reports came in as scattered anomalies. Ship lost contact, ship missing from formation, engine failure suspected. Then more reports. Then more. The tactical display began to flicker with amber alerts that quickly turned red. Talek was the first to say the word out loud. "We are under attack." Xerak turned to his sensor officer. "Show me." The display updated. 31 ships gone. The losses were concentrated at the rear of the formation, spread across a wide area. There was no visible enemy, no weapon signatures, no incoming fire that the sensors could detect. Ships were simply dying. "Where is the attack coming from?" Xerak demanded. "I do not know, Grand Admiral. When there are no enemy vessels on any sensor, no weapon trails, no energy signatures. The ships are being destroyed by physical impacts based on the debris patterns. Kinetic weapons of some kind, but I cannot locate the source." "Kinetic weapons." Xerak's voice was flat. "They are throwing rocks at us." It was meant as contempt, but even as he said it, another cluster of ships vanished from the display. The second swarm had arrived, coming from a slightly different angle, hitting the fleet's lower flank. 44 more ships died in the space of 3 minutes. Now the bridge was no longer calm. Officers were shouting status reports. Damage control teams were being scrambled across the fleet. The rear echelon had broken formation, ships scattering in panic as their neighbors exploded around them. Xerak raised one hand. Entrin and the bridge fell silent. "All ships, tighten formation. Activate point defense systems. Full power to all sensors. Find me the enemy." The fleet responded. 4,000 ships adjusted their positions, pulling inward, overlapping their sensor coverage and defense grids. Point defense turrets, designed to shoot down incoming missiles and fighters, began scanning the space around the fleet for targets. They found nothing. The swarm warheads were too small, too cold, and too slow relative to the background to distinguish from ordinary space debris. The point defense systems tracked thousands of objects, but none of them looked like weapons. They looked like rocks, tiny, insignificant rocks, drifting in the dark, until they hit. The third swarm came from above the formation, striking the upper screen of escort vessels. 58 ships were destroyed. Then the fourth swarm from the starboard flank. 39 more. In the space of 2 hours, Xerak lost 172 ships. Nearly 200 warships, crewed by tens of thousands of Vreth warriors, wiped out by weapons they could not see, fired by an enemy they could not find. Zarek stood at the center of his bridge and felt the uncertainty grow into something larger. He had fought enemies who used mines. He had fought enemies who used stealth ships. He had fought enemies who used traps. But he had never fought an enemy who could kill nearly 200 of his ships without revealing themselves even once. He opened a channel to his entire fleet. His voice was steady because a Grand Admiral's voice was always steady, even when the world was burning around him. All ships, or this is Grand Admiral Zarek, we are under attack from automated weapon systems, likely pre-positioned by the enemy in our projected path. These are the desperate measures of a primitive species that knows it cannot face us in open battle. We will increase speed and push through this obstacle. Maintain formation discipline. The Dominion does not retreat from machines. The fleet accelerated. Zarek was betting that the weapons were limited, that the humans had seeded a finite number of them in the outer system, and that pushing through quickly would leave the danger behind. He was partly right. The swarm attacks did decrease as the fleet moved faster, outrunning some of the slower intercept trajectories. But they did not stop entirely. Over the next 18 hours, as the Armada pushed inward past the orbit of Uranus, another 40 ships were picked off by warheads that had been placed on deeper, longer trajectories. Zarek now stood at his display and counted his losses. 193 ships destroyed since entering the system. Nearly 5% of his fleet, gone before he had even seen the enemy. The damage was not crippling. He still had over 4,000 warships, but the manner of the losses disturbed him in a way he could not quite name. He called Talik to his private quarters. "First officer, give me your honest assessment." Talik was not a political creature. He was a soldier and he spoke like one. "Grand Admiral, this is not the behavior of a primitive species. The weapons we have encountered are crude in design, but brilliant in deployment. They were placed years in advance, on trajectories calculated to intercept a fleet approaching from our exact vector. The enemy knew where we would come from, and they prepared for it." "The Talari," Zarek said. "Yes, the refugees. They must have reached this system before they died. They told the humans about us." Zarek sat in his chair and was quiet for a long time. The Talari, a broken, dying species that the Dominion had crushed without a second thought, and they had used their last years of life to warn another world. "It changes nothing," Zarek said finally. "They know we are coming. They have prepared. But preparation is not the same as strength. We have seen their best weapons, and they are kinetic projectiles and hidden platforms. Clever, but limited. When we reach their inner system, we will see their true military capability, and I promise you, dear First Officer, it will not be enough." Tolek saluted and left. But as he walked down the corridor to the bridge, he thought about the invisible weapons that had killed almost 200 ships, and he was not so sure. In the war room, Voronov reviewed the after-action reports from Phase 1. The numbers were good. Nearly 200 enemy ships destroyed, and the Vreth still had no idea what had hit them. But Voronov was not celebrating. "They have adjusted," he said, looking at the fleet's new formation. "Tighter, faster, with better sensor coverage. Zarek is not a fool. He pushed through the swarm field faster than we projected. Some of the deeper swarm packages will miss their intercept windows." "We still took almost 200, Okafor pointed out, out of 4,000. "It is a scratch, Commander. A painful scratch. Ash, but a scratch. He has learned from it. He will be more cautious now, more alert. The next phase will not be as easy." He turned to the display showing the Vreth fleet's projected path. They were heading inward, toward Jupiter, toward the real fight. "Send the alert to Admiral Tanaka. Tell her the enemy has entered the engagement zone faster than expected. She needs to be ready." Okafor sent the message. Then she looked at Voronov. "Sir, do you think they have any idea what is waiting for them at Jupiter?" Voronov watched the red dots moving across the display. 4,000 ships carrying millions of Vreth warriors, sailing with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat. "No," he said, "and that is the only advantage that matters." In the cold space between Uranus and Saturn, the Vreth Armada pressed on. Behind them, the debris of their destroyed ships drifted in silence, cooling slowly in the empty dark. Ahead of them, the solar system waited. Zarak stood on his bridge and stared into the blackness ahead. He had won 40 campaigns. He had broken species with warp technology and planetary shields. He had earned the title the Unbroken through decades of flawless victory. But tonight, standing on his bridge, looking into the dark space that had just eaten almost 200 of his ships without showing him a single enemy, he felt something he had not felt since he was a young officer on his first campaign. He felt like he was being watched. His sensor officer approached, his voice careful and quiet. "Grand Admiral, I have completed the full analysis of the attacks. I have mapped every impact, every weapon trajectory, every piece of debris. And the weapons came from 14 different origin points, spread across a volume of space larger than this entire star system. They were launched years apart, some of them possibly decades ago. All of them converged on our exact path at the exact right time." Zarak said nothing. "Grand Admiral, whoever planned this did not just know we were coming. They knew exactly when we would arrive, exactly which route we would take, and exactly where our ships would be in formation. They have been preparing for us for a very long time." The bridge was silent. Every officer had stopped working. Every eye was on Zarak. The Grand Admiral straightened his back and clasped his four hands behind him. When he spoke, his voice was iron. "Then they will learn that preparation is not enough to stop the Dominion. I'd continue the advance. All ships, full alert. We moved to the inner system." The fleet obeyed. 4,000 ships, minus the dead, surged forward through the dark. But the dark was not empty. It had never been empty. And in the cold spaces ahead, things were waking up that would make the swarm attacks look like a gentle rain before the storm. Admiral Yuki Tanaka had been living inside a rock for 3 years. The asteroid was called Hector, one of the largest objects in the Trojan cluster that shared Jupiter's orbit. From the outside, it looked like any other dead rock floating in space. Cratered, gray, unremarkable. But the inside had been hollowed out over 2 decades and turned into the most powerful naval base humanity had ever built. 4 carrier groups were hidden here, tucked into the radiation shadow of Jupiter, where no alien sensor could reach. Over 200 warships of various sizes, from fast corvettes to heavy cruisers, along with thousands of unmanned combat drones stored in launch racks like sleeping wasps. The crews had been living in the rock for months, training, running simulations, and waiting for the call. The call had come 3 days ago. Tanaka stood in the command center of the ISS Defiance, her flagship. She was a small woman, barely over 5 feet tall, with gray hair cut short and eyes that her crew described as either calm or terrifying, depending on the situation. She had spent her entire career in the Solar Defense Forces, rising through the ranks not through politics or connections, but through a simple reputation. She won. She always won. And she took care of her people. Right now, her people were scared. They tried not to show it, but she could see it in the way they moved, the way they checked their instruments one too many times, the way they laughed a little too loudly at bad jokes in the mess hall. They were about to fight an alien fleet that outnumbered them 20-1. They had every right to be scared. Tanaka addressed her fleet over the command channel. She did not give a long speech. She was not that kind of admiral. "This is Tanaka. The enemy fleet will enter Jupiter space in approximately 14 hours. They are coming to kill us and everyone we have ever loved. We are going to make them regret that decision. All ships, begin deployment. Follow the plan. Trust your training. I will see you on the other side." The asteroid opened its doors and the fleet poured out into the darkness. They scattered quickly, each ship group heading to its pre-assigned position. Some hid behind Jupiter's moons. Others settled into orbits within the gas giant's massive radiation belts, where the electromagnetic noise would mask their presence. The drone carriers positioned themselves at the flanks, ready to release their swarms at the right moment. Tanaka had studied the Vreth for years. She knew their tactics, their formations, their preferred engagement ranges. She knew that Vreth warships were powerful, with heavy energy weapons and strong shields designed to absorb and deflect directed energy attacks. But she also knew their weakness, a weakness that was built into the very logic of their military doctrine. The Vreth had never fought an enemy that used kinetic weapons at relativistic speeds. Every species they had conquered used energy weapons, because energy weapons were the standard across the galaxy. Shields were designed to stop energy weapons. Armor was designed to resist energy weapons. The entire Vreth military machine was built around fighting enemies who shot light at them. Humanity did not shoot light. Humanity shot metal. The kinetic lance accelerators were the backbone of the human fleet. Each capital ship carried between 2 and 6 of them. They were in principle simple devices. They were magnetic accelerators, mass drivers, railguns scaled up to sizes that would have made the engineers of the previous century weep with joy. They fired tungsten rods, each one about 2 meters long, at 10% of the speed of light. At that velocity, a tungsten rod carried more kinetic energy than a nuclear warhead. And no shield in the galaxy could stop it, because the Vreth shields were designed to absorb energy, not solid matter traveling at 30,000 kilometers per second. Tanaka had 14 hours. She used every minute. The Vreth fleet entered Jupiter space on schedule, their formation tight and alert. Zarek had learned from the outer system attacks. He had pulled his screening vessels closer, increased his sensor output, and placed his heaviest ships at the front and flanks. The formation bristled with weapons, ready to respond to any threat. He expected mines. He expected more invisible kinetic swarms. He was prepared for those. He was not prepared for what he found. The first sign of trouble was a gravitational anomaly near Europa. The Vreth sensors detected a brief fluctuation, as though something massive had moved near the moon. Then it was gone. Then another anomaly near Callisto. Then another near Ganymede. The anomalies were small, fleeting, impossible to pin down. "There is something hiding in the moon system," the sensor officer reported. "Multiple contacts, but I cannot get a clear reading. The radiation interference is too heavy." Zarek studied the display. Jupiter filled one side of it, a massive wall of swirling gas and color. The radiation belts surrounding the planet were enormous, powerful enough to fry unshielded electronics in minutes. His own ships were protected, but their sensors were degraded in this environment. "The humans chose this ground deliberately," he said. "The radiation masks their presence. Clever." "Shall we bypass Jupiter entirely, Grand Admiral?" Talek asked. "Or not, we could adjust course and proceed directly to the inner system." "No," Zarek's voice was firm. "If they have forces here, I will not leave an enemy at my back. We clear this area, then we advance. All ships, combat formation. Weapons free. Prepare to engage." 4,000 ships shifted into battle formation. The Armada spread out, weapons charged, sensors straining to pierce the electromagnetic fog of Jupiter's radiation. They moved forward slowly, cautiously, like a great beast sniffing the air for danger. They found it. Tanaka gave the order at 11:42 hours. One word: fire, from behind the moons, from within the radiation belts, from positions that the Vreth had been staring at for hours without seeing anything. The human fleet opened fire. The kinetic lances spoke first. Tungsten rods streaked across the void at a significant fraction of the speed of light. At that velocity, there was almost no time between firing and impact. The rods were invisible to the naked eye, too fast to track, too small to register on sensors until it was far too late. The first Vreth dreadnought took 3 rods through its center mass. The shields flared, absorbing the electromagnetic component of the impact. But the rods themselves passed through the shield like it was not there. They hit the armor and punched through it as if it were wet paper. The ship broke apart from the inside, its structural supports shattered, its reactor breached. It exploded in a silent flash that was visible from every ship in the formation. Then the ship next to it died. Then the ship next to that one. Then 5 more. Then 20. The Vreth formation erupted into chaos. Ships that had been sailing in perfect order suddenly found themselves surrounded by the wreckage of their neighbors. Debris slammed into hulls. Chain reactions of exploding ships tore holes in the formation. Officers screamed for orders. Point defense systems fired wildly at targets they could not see. Zarek watched his tactical display turn red with the cold focus of a commander who understood that he was in trouble. Real trouble. Not the scratches of the outer system, but a genuine fight for survival. "All ships, return fire on detected launch points," he ordered. The Vreth fleet responded with everything it had. Thousands of energy weapons fired into the positions where the human ships were hiding. Plasma bolts and particle beams lit up the darkness around Jupiter's moons. evaporizing rock and ice, turning the surfaces of Callisto and Ganymede into glowing hellscapes. Some of the shots found their targets. Human ships died. A cruiser hiding behind Europa took a direct hit from a Vreth capital ship and broke in half. A carrier group near Io was caught in a crossfire and lost 3 ships in seconds. Human blood was being spilled now, and Tanaka felt every loss like a knife in her chest. But the human ships were fast, faster than anything the Vreth had ever seen. They used Jupiter's moons as cover, darting out to fire their kinetic lances, and then slipping back into the radiation belts before the Vreth could target them. It was hit and run on a scale that Zerak had never experienced. The humans fought like wolves, striking from the shadows, vanishing, then striking again from a different direction. And then the drones came. Tanaka launched the swarms. Thousands of unmanned combat drones poured out of their carrier ships like clouds of insects. Each drone was small, fast, and cheap. Each one carried a single shape-charged warhead, and they were controlled not by individual pilots, but by a networked artificial intelligence that treated the entire swarm as a single organism. The swarm did not think like a person, it thought like a predator. It identified the weakest points in the Vreth formation, the ships with damaged shields, the vessels that had fallen out of position, the gaps created by destroyed ships, and it poured through those gaps like water through cracks in a dam. Vreth point defense systems were designed to shoot down missiles and fighters. They were very good at it. They destroyed hundreds of drones in the first minutes of contact, but for every drone they killed, 3 more took its place. The swarm adapted in real time, learning the firing patterns of the point defense turrets, predicting where the shots would go, flowing around the defensive fire like a river flowing around rocks. The drones hit the Vreth ships in waves. They targeted engine nacelles, sensor arrays, shield generators, weapon mounts. They did not try to destroy the ships outright. They crippled them. A dreadnought with no engines was a sitting target. A destroyer with no sensors was blind. A cruiser with no shields was naked. And behind the drones, the human warships came again with their kinetic lances, firing into the crippled ships, finishing what the swarms had started. The battle raged for 6 hours. 6 hours of constant, brutal, close-range combat around the moons of Jupiter. The radiation belts crackled with energy discharges. The surfaces of the moons were scarred with impact craters from stray shots. Debris fields spread across thousands of kilometers, making navigation increasingly dangerous for both sides. Zerak fought with everything he had. He was a brilliant commander, and even in the chaos, he adapted. He pulled his fleet into a tighter sphere, concentrating his firepower, creating overlapping fields of defense that the drones could not easily penetrate. He identified the positions of the human carriers and focused his heaviest weapons on them, destroying 4 carriers in a coordinated strike that sent a wave of grief through the human fleet. But every time he stabilized his formation, the humans shifted their tactics. Yes, they were not following a rigid plan. They were thinking, adapting, improvising in real time. Their commanders were talking to each other, sharing information, adjusting their approach minute by minute. It was a style of warfare the Vreth had never encountered, a style built not on rigid discipline and overwhelming force, but on flexibility, creativity, and a willingness to take risks. By the 12th hour, it was over. The space around Jupiter was a graveyard. Over 1,000 Vreth ships had been destroyed or crippled beyond repair. The human fleet had paid dearly, losing nearly 60 ships and thousands of lives. But they had held. They had more than held. They had savaged the most powerful fleet the Dominion had ever assembled. Zerak ordered a retreat. Not a full retreat, but a pullback to the asteroid belt to regroup and assess damage. His fleet, once a perfect formation of 4,000 warships, was now a battered, ragged collection of barely 3,000 combat-capable vessels. Many of those were damaged. Morale was shattered. Officers who had never known defeat were staring at their displays with hollow eyes, trying to understand what had just happened. For the first time in his long career, Zerak composed a message to Vreth High Command, requesting reinforcements. He stared at the words on his screen for a long time before he sent them. Each word felt like a confession of failure. Grand Admiral Zerak to Dominion High Command. The target species has demonstrated military capabilities far beyond initial intelligence assessments. Engagement at the fifth planet resulted in significant losses. One, fleet strength reduced to approximately 3,000 combat-capable vessels. Enemy employs kinetic weapons of extreme velocity, autonomous combat swarms of high sophistication, and tactics of unusual adaptability. Request reinforcement. This campaign will not be resolved quickly. He sent the message. Then he sat alone on his bridge and stared at the distant dot of light that was Jupiter, now behind them. In the glow of that gas giant, he had lost 1,000 ships. 1,000 ships filled with Vreth who would never go home. His sensor officer approached carefully. Grand Admiral, we have intercepted a transmission from the enemy fleet. It is unencrypted. I believe they intended us to hear it. Play it. The voice that filled the bridge was female, speaking in the human language that the translator rendered into Vreth. It was calm and almost gentle, and somehow that made it worse. This is Admiral Yuki Tanaka, commanding officer of the Jovian Defense Fleet. To the commander of the Vreth Armada, you have entered our home. You have come to take what is ours. Today you learn that we will not give it to you. Turn back. Leave our system. This is the only warning you will receive. The bridge was silent. Every Vreth officer stared at the speakers as though the voice itself were a weapon. Zarak turned off the transmission. She is brave, he said quietly. But bravery does not win wars. Numbers win wars. We still have 3,000 ships. They showed us perhaps 200. The mathematics still favor us. He straightened in his chair. Set course for the inner system. We bypass their remaining forces and proceed directly to their colonies. We take their worlds. Afern and their fleet will have nothing left to defend. The fleet began to move again, limping but still dangerous, still vast, still carrying enough firepower to burn worlds. They left the Jupiter system behind, heading inward toward the asteroid belt, toward Mars, toward Earth. On the Defiance, Tanaka watched them go. Her ship was damaged, her fleet was battered, and she had lost friends today. Good people, brave people. She allowed herself 1 minute of grief, standing alone in her quarters with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against the cold metal wall. Then she opened her eyes and walked back to the bridge. All surviving ships, form up. We follow them. Mars will need everything we have left. Her communications officer relayed her after-action report to Solcom. The report was detailed and honest. They had performed well, and they had exceeded expectations. But the enemy still had 3,000 ships, and Jupiter had cost the human fleet dearly. In the war room, Voronov read the report in silence. When he finished, he looked at Okafor. She cut them by a quarter. That is better than any simulation predicted. It is, Okafor agreed. But he still has 3,000 ships, sir, and he is heading for Mars now. He is not stopping. He is not regrouping. He is angry, and he is going straight for our people. Voronov nodded slowly. Then we give him what he is looking for. Activate the Ares protocol. Tell Mars to prepare. He paused, looking at the display. The red dots were moving inward, still numerous, still dangerous. And ahead of them, the small red circle of Mars waited. She bought us everything we needed, Voronov said quietly. He was talking about Tanaka. Now we use it. 2 million people on Mars were about to become the front line of humanity's last stand, and the weapons buried under their feet were about to shake the very foundations of what the galaxy believed was possible. Governor Amara Diallo had never wanted to be a wartime leader. She was an engineer by training, a builder by nature. She had come to Mars 20 years ago as part of the third colonial wave, when the underground cities were still being carved from the red rock. She had spent 2 decades turning those tunnels into homes, into schools, into parks with artificial sunlight, where children played under simulated blue skies. She had become governor because people trusted her to keep building, to keep making Mars a better place to live. Now she was standing in the emergency command center of Olympus City, the largest settlement on Mars, looking at a tactical display that showed 3,000 alien warships heading straight for her planet. How long, she asked. Colonel James Park, the military commander of the Mars garrison, checked his terminal. At current speed, the Vreth fleet will reach Mars orbital space in approximately 19 hours. 19 hours. Diallo looked at the display and did the math she had been avoiding. 2 million people lived on Mars, spread across 6 underground cities. There was no way to evacuate them. There was nowhere to go. The transport ships that connected Mars to Earth were fast, but not fast enough to outrun a Vreth warship. If the enemy reached Mars, there was no running. The Ares Protocol, she said. It was not a question. She had been briefed on it when she became governor, but she had never truly believed it would be used. It had seemed like an abstraction, a nightmare scenario locked away in classified files. Yes, Governor, Solcom has authorized full activation. The weapon systems are powering up now. Diallo closed her eyes for a moment. The Ares Protocol was humanity's most terrible secret, buried beneath the surface of Mars, hidden under Olympus Mons and the Tharsis Plateau and half a dozen other locations, were the largest weapons ever constructed by human hands. They were directed energy arrays, massive installations that focus gamma radiation into concentrated beams, powerful enough to vaporize a warship at a distance of millions of kilometers. They were powered by antimatter. Humanity had been producing and stockpiling antimatter for 50 years, microgram by painstaking microgram. So the total stockpile was small by weight, barely a few grams, but the energy contained in those few grams was staggering. Each firing cycle consumed a portion of the stockpile and converted it into a beam of pure destruction that nothing in the known galaxy could withstand. But the weapons had a cost. They were huge and they drew enormous amounts of power. Every time the arrays fired, they would drain the power grid that kept the underground cities alive. Life support would falter, air recyclers would stall, heating systems would fail. For minutes at a time between each shot, 2 million people would be sitting in the cold and the dark, breathing air that was slowly running out. Diallo opened her eyes. How long between shots? Approximately 7 minutes for the primary arrays to recharge. During that window, when we will need to manage power carefully, I recommend cycling life support systems across the cities in sequence, so no single city goes completely dark. 7 minutes. Diallo thought of the children in the schools, the elderly in the medical centers, the families in their homes. 7 minutes without heat on a planet where the surface temperature was minus 60 degrees. 7 minutes without air recycling in sealed underground tunnels. We can survive 7 minutes, she said. We cannot survive the Vreth. She turned to her communications officer. Open a channel to all cities. I want to speak to everyone. 5 minutes later, her voice filled every tunnel, every home, every corridor on Mars. This is Governor Diallo. By now, many of you have heard the reports. An alien fleet is approaching Mars. I will not lie to you about the danger. It is real. It is serious. But I want you to know that we are not undefended. Weapon systems have been activated that will protect our planet. When these weapons fire, you will feel it. The lights will dim. The air will get thin. It will be frightening. I am asking you to be brave. I am asking you to trust that the lights will come back on. I am asking you to take care of each other during the dark minutes. We are Martians. We carved our homes out of rock and ice. We can endure this. She paused. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Hold your children close. Check on your neighbors. And know that every person in uniform on this planet and beyond it is fighting for you right now. We will get through this. Together. She ended the transmission and leaned against the console, was suddenly exhausted. Colonel Park put a hand on her shoulder. That was good, Governor. They needed to hear that. I needed to say it, she replied. The hours passed. Mars prepared. In the cities, people followed the emergency protocols they had practiced but never believed they would use. Families gathered in designated shelter zones. Medical teams pre-positioned supplies in case of power failures. Engineers ran final checks on backup generators and emergency air supplies. Everyone was scared, but they were also doing what needed to be done. Beneath the surface, the Ares arrays powered up. Deep in the rock of Olympus Mons, the primary array hummed with a sound that could be felt more than heard, a vibration that traveled through the stone and made the walls of the nearest city tremble. While the antimatter containment systems reported green across the board, the targeting computers locked onto the approaching fleet, tracking 3,000 contacts with patient, mechanical precision. And from the direction of Jupiter, Battered but still fighting, Admiral Tanaka's fleet was coming. The Defiance had taken heavy damage at Jupiter. One of her main engines was gone, and her port kinetic lance was destroyed. But her remaining weapons worked. Her crew was alive, and Tanaka was not the kind of person who let damage reports stop her. She had gathered every ship that could still fly, 87 vessels out of the original 200, and pushed them at maximum speed toward Mars. They would arrive just as the Vreth fleet entered Mars orbital space. It would be close, dangerously close. Admiral, Solcom confirms the Ares protocol is active, her communications officer reported. Mars garrison is at full readiness. Governor Diallo sends her regards and says, and I am quoting directly, please hurry. Tanaka allowed herself a brief smile. Tell the governor we are coming as fast as we can, and tell her to save some of them for us. The Vreth fleet arrived at Mars 16 hours later. Zarek had used the transit time well. He had reorganized his fleet, distributed damaged ships into support roles, and placed his strongest remaining dreadnoughts at the front of the formation. He had analyzed the battle at Jupiter and developed countermeasures. His shields now rotated frequencies to make it harder for kinetic weapons to predict impact points. His point defense systems had been recalibrated to better detect high-velocity projectiles. He was hurt, but he was not beaten, and he was determined to make the humans pay for what they had done to his fleet. He studied Mars on his display, a small, red, dusty world, thin atmosphere, underground cities according to his intelligence, 2 million inhabitants. We will approach in standard siege formation, he told his officers. If they have weapons on the surface, they will reveal them when we come within range. We absorb the first volley with our forward screen, identify the weapon positions, and destroy them with concentrated fire. Then we take the planet. His officers acknowledged. The fleet moved into siege formation, a broad, layered approach with expendable ships at the front and heavy capital ships behind. It was a formation designed to absorb punishment and then deliver overwhelming force. They came within range of Mars at 0817 hours. The first shot from the Ares array struck without warning. There was no missile to track, no projectile to see. One moment, the Vreth Dreadnought Steel Mandate was sailing at the front of the formation with full shields and combat readiness. The next moment, it ceased to exist. The gamma ray burst hit it with an energy density that overwhelmed its shields in microseconds and vaporized the hull in milliseconds. The ship did not explode. It simply vanished, replaced by a rapidly expanding cloud of plasma. The ship next to it was caught in the edge of the beam and broke apart, its hull melting like wax. A third ship, slightly farther away, survived but was so badly damaged that it tumbled out of formation, dead and dark. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, the tactical display flashed red. 3 ships gone in an instant. Zarek stared at the data, trying to understand what he was seeing. Report. What hit them? Directed energy weapon, Grand Admiral. Gamma ray spectrum. Origin point is the surface of Mars. The weapon is incredibly powerful. Our shields had no measurable effect. Gamma rays. Zarek knew the physics. Gamma radiation was the most energetic form of light in the universe. A weapon that could focus gamma rays into a coherent beam would be devastating against any target. But the energy required to produce such a beam at this range was enormous, far beyond what a primitive species should be able to generate. They have antimatter, he said quietly. It was the only explanation. Only matter-antimatter reactions could produce enough energy to power a weapon like that. How is that possible? Tolek demanded. Our intelligence said they had no advanced energy production. Our intelligence was wrong, Zarek replied, as it has been wrong about everything else concerning this species. The second shot came 7 minutes later. Another dreadnought vaporized. 2 escorts gutted by the beam's edge. The Vreth formation shuddered. Zarek made his decision quickly. Sitting still and absorbing these shots was death. He had to close the distance, get his fleet close enough to Mars that the surface weapons could not fire without risking their own planet. And he had to do it fast before those weapons chewed his fleet to pieces. All ships, maximum acceleration, close to planetary orbit, attack formation. 3,000 ships surged forward. The Ares arrays fired again, and again, and again. Each shot destroyed or crippled 2 to 4 ships. Each shot was followed by 7 minutes of silence as the arrays recharged. Zarak timed the intervals perfectly and drove his fleet forward in the gaps between shots, accepting losses but closing the distance with every cycle. On Mars, the lights went out. In Olympus City, the first power cycle hit like a physical blow. The lights died. The air recyclers stopped. The background hum that every Martian lived with, the constant sound of machines keeping them alive, went silent. 200,000 people sat in absolute darkness and felt the cold begin to creep in. Diallo stood in the emergency command center, lit only by battery-powered emergency lamps. She watched the clock. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. The temperature was already dropping. She could see her breath. "Governor, the primary array has fired. Recharge cycle beginning. Power restoration in 4 minutes." 4 minutes. An eternity in the dark. Diallo could hear sounds from the corridors outside. Crying. Voices calling out. A child screaming for her mother. "All cities report," she asked. "Meridian City is on backup generators. Valley's hub has switched to emergency air reserves. All cities are functional, but it is not pleasant. It is not supposed to be pleasant. It is supposed to keep us alive." The lights came back on after 7 minutes. The air recyclers hummed back to life. People gasped in relief. Then 3 minutes later, the arrays fired again, and the lights went out again. It went on like this for hours. Fire, darkness, cold, silence. Then light and air again for a few minutes. Then darkness again. A rhythm of terror and relief that wore on the nerves of every person on Mars. In the shelters, Naka people held each other. Parents wrapped their children in every blanket they could find. Elderly residents were moved to the innermost tunnels, where the rock itself held residual heat. Medical teams worked by flashlight, tending to people who had panic attacks or whose health conditions were aggravated by the cold and the thin air. And above them, the sky was on fire. The Vareth fleet pushed forward through the Ares bombardment. They were dying, ship by ship, but they were closing the distance. Zarak threw his heaviest ships forward as shields, accepting their destruction to buy time for the rest of the fleet. It was brutal, ruthless calculus, spending lives to gain kilometers, but it was working. Then Tanaka arrived. The Jovian fleet, 87 damaged, exhausted, battered ships, dropped out of high-speed approach on the Vreth flank. And they did not have the strength for another Jupiter-scale battle. They did not need to. Tanaka had one objective, and she had calculated the cost. She split her fleet in two. The larger group, 60 ships under Captain Reyes, engaged the Vareth flank, drawing fire and creating chaos. The smaller group, 27 ships led by Tanaka herself on the Defiance, drove straight into the heart of the Vreth formation. It was a suicide run. Everyone knew it. Tanaka knew it. Her crew knew it. They went anyway. The Defiance and her escorts punched through the outer screen of Vreth ships, firing kinetic lances at point-blank range. At these distances, the tungsten rods barely needed to accelerate. They tore through ship after ship, leaving a trail of wreckage. But the Vreth were firing back, and at this range, they did not miss. Where ships around the Defiance began to die, the destroyer Magellan took a plasma bolt through her reactor and vanished in a white flash. The cruiser Sun Tzu was raked by particle beams and broke apart. One by one, Tanaka's escorts were torn away from her. But they had done their job. They had driven a wedge into the Vreth formation, forcing ships apart, creating a gap. And through that gap, the Ares arrays had a clear line of fire into the densest concentration of enemy vessels. Tanaka opened a channel to Mars. "Governor Diallo, I have opened a corridor. Fire the primary array now, bearing 270, elevation 15. You have a clear shot into their core." Diallo looked at Colonel Park. He confirmed the targeting data with a nod. She gave the order. The primary array under Olympus Mons fired its most powerful shot yet. The gamma ray burst streaked through the gap in the Vreth formation and hit the dense cluster of capital ships at its center. 23 ships were destroyed instantly. 14 more were crippled. The heart of the Vreth Armada was ripped open like a wound. On the throne of silence, Zarak watched his tactical display with the expression of a man watching his own funeral. The center of his formation was gone. Nearly 40 ships destroyed in a single shot, and the flanking attack was still tearing at his edges. His fleet was disintegrating around him. Grand Admiral, we must withdraw, Tulloch said. His voice was urgent, almost pleading. If we remain, we will lose everything. Zarak did not answer immediately. He was watching one ship on his display, a small human vessel, badly damaged, surrounded by Vreth warships, still fighting. It was the Defiance, Tanaka's ship. The Defiance was dying. Her shields were gone. Her hull was breached in a dozen places. Half her crew was dead, but her remaining kinetic lance was still firing, still killing, still spitting tungsten rods into every Vreth ship within range. Tanaka stood on her shattered bridge, bleeding from a wound on her forehead, and directed her ship's fire with calm, precise orders. A Vreth dreadnought turned its main weapon on the Defiance. The plasma bolt hit the human flagship amidships. The ship broke in two. The forward section tumbled, burning. The aft section exploded. Admiral Yuki Tanaka, along with 314 members of her crew, was gone. But she had won. The gap she had torn in the Vreth formation could not be closed. The Ares arrays kept firing through it, shot after shot, for each one carving deeper into the enemy fleet. Captain Reyes took command of the surviving human ships and pressed the attack from the flank, keeping the Vreth disorganized and unable to reform. The battle lasted 11 hours from first contact to last shot. When it finally ended, the space between Mars and the asteroid belt was a graveyard. 2,800 Vreth warships had been destroyed over the course of the entire battle. From the first Ares shot to the last drone strike, the red planet floated in a sea of twisted metal and cooling debris. Zarak's flagship survived, barely. The Throne of Silence had taken multiple hits, and entire sections of the ship were open to space. Fewer than 400 Vreth ships remained combat-capable. 400 out of 4,200. Zarak stood on what was left of his bridge and looked at the remains of his armada. The greatest fleet ever assembled by the Vreth Dominion, the fleet that was supposed to crush a primitive species in a matter of hours, was destroyed. His first officer spoke from behind him. Grand Admiral, what are your orders? Zarak stared at the red planet that had broken his fleet and whispered words that no Vreth Grand Admiral had ever spoken. What are they? He shook himself, straightened his back, clasped his four hands behind him, though one of them was broken and hung at a wrong angle. All ships, full retreat, maximum speed, we leave this system. The surviving ships began to turn. Damaged engines fired. The remnants of the mightiest armada in Vreth history limped toward the outer system, when heading for the edge of the solar system where they could engage their faster-than-light drives and flee. Then a transmission came through. Not a weapon, not a threat. A voice calm and cold, translated into Vreth and broadcast on every frequency. This is Fleet Admiral Konstantin Voronov of the United Nations Solar Defense Command, speaking to the commander of the Vreth invasion fleet. Zarak listened. You came to our home. You will not leave it. The transmission ended. The bridge was silent. Tulloch looked at Zarak. Grand Admiral, what does he mean? Zarak did not answer. He was staring at his sensors, at the space ahead of them, the space between Mars and the outer system, the space they needed to cross to escape. His sensor officer looked up from his console with an expression that Zarak had never seen on a Vreth face before. It was terror. Grand Admiral, I am detecting multiple high-velocity contacts on intercept trajectories from multiple vectors. Hundreds of contacts. They are moving at approximately 30% of light speed. They are converging on our position. Zarak closed his eyes. On Mars, the lights came back on and stayed on. The Ares arrays fell silent. In the shelters, people looked at each other, not yet believing it was over. Children uncurled from their parents' arms. Old hands stopped shaking. Governor Diallo stood in the command center and watched the red dots on the display begin to turn away from Mars. She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for 11 hours. They are retreating, Colonel Park confirmed. No, Diallo said quietly. She was looking at the other side of the display, at the blue dots that were converging on the fleeing red dots from every direction. They are not retreating. They are trying to. She sat down heavily in her chair and thought of Admiral Tanaka, the small woman with the gray hair and the terrifying eyes who had given her life to protect a planet she had never lived on. Thank you, Diallo whispered. She was not sure if she was talking to Tanaka or to God, or to the universe itself. It did not matter. She said it again. Thank you. The kill vehicles had been launched 9 days ago. Nobody in the Freth fleet knew that. Nobody on Earth talked about it except in the most classified rooms in the most secure buildings on the planet. Project Fenrir was humanity's final insurance policy, the last line of defense. The weapon that was never supposed to be needed, but was built anyway, because humans had learned a long time ago that hope was not a strategy. The concept was simple. The execution was anything but. Massive, unmanned projectiles, each one the size of a bus, had been placed in orbits throughout the solar system years in advance. When the invasion alert sounded, they were given their orders and fired their engines. Not toward the enemy, but away from them, looping outward on long, curving trajectories that used the gravity of planets and moons to slingshot them to tremendous speed. They swung around Jupiter. They curved past Saturn. They dove toward the sun and used its gravity to whip them back outward. Each loop added speed. Each pass brought them closer to their final trajectory. By the time the Vreth fleet was retreating from Mars, the Fenrir vehicles had been accelerating for over a week. They were now moving at 30% of the speed of light, and they were converging on the fleeing Armada from 7 different directions. At that speed, they could not be dodged. They could not be shot down. They could barely be detected. Each vehicle was a solid block of tungsten and depleted uranium, carrying no explosives, no warheads, no electronics beyond a simple guidance chip that would burn out from its own friction with the thin interplanetary medium long before impact. They did not need explosives. At 30% of light speed, the kinetic energy of each impact was equivalent to a small nuclear weapon, and there were hundreds of them. Zarek's sensor officer was the first to see them. The officer had been working without sleep for nearly 2 days, Emery running on stimulants and fear, and at first he thought his instruments were malfunctioning. The contacts appeared on his screen as faint traces, barely distinguishable from noise. But they were moving too fast to be anything natural, and there were too many of them to be a coincidence. He ran the calculations 3 times before he was sure. Then he reported to the Grand Admiral with a voice that shook despite his best efforts to control it. Grand Admiral, I am detecting hundreds of objects approaching our fleet from multiple vectors. Velocity is approximately 30% of light speed. Impact in approximately 7 minutes. Zarek was standing at the center of what remained of his bridge. Half the stations were dark. Cables hung from the ceiling where hull breaches had been hastily patched. The air smelled of burnt metal and blood. And he looked at his sensor officer and understood immediately what was happening. The humans had not just defended their worlds. They had built a cage. The attacks in the outer system, the battle at Jupiter, the stand at Mars, none of it was the real weapon. The real weapon had been launched before the first shot was fired, sent on a journey of days, building speed in the dark, waiting for the exact moment when the Vreth fleet would be damaged, demoralized, and fleeing along a predictable path. He had been herded, like an animal. Every battle, every engagement, every tactical decision he had made since entering the system had pushed him exactly where the humans wanted him to be. And now the trap was closing. "Can we evade?" he asked. He already knew the answer. "No, Grand Admiral. At their velocity, course correction is not possible. We cannot change our trajectory enough in 7 minutes to avoid the convergence zone. Can we intercept them? Our point defense systems cannot track objects at that speed. We would need to fire a wall of energy across our entire front. And even then, the objects are too small and too fast." Zarek looked around his bridge at the faces of his officers. They were Vreth. They were warriors. They had conquered 300 species, and they were looking at him with the eyes of people who knew they were about to die. He opened a channel to his fleet, all 400 surviving ships. "This is Grand Admiral Zarek. All ships, activate maximum shielding. Spread formation to maximum dispersal. Point defense systems, fire at will at anything approaching at high velocity. All crew members, brace for impact." It was all he could do. Aiden spread the formation so that the incoming projectiles could not destroy multiple ships with a single impact. Turn on every shield, every weapon, every defensive system, and hope. Hope was not a strategy. The humans had taught him that. The first Fenrir vehicle arrived at 14:23 hours. It struck a Vreth destroyer on the port flank at 90,000 kilometers per second. The kinetic energy released was beyond anything the ship's designers had ever imagined. The destroyer did not explode. It was atomized. The impact converted the entire mass of the vehicle and a significant portion of the ship into plasma and radiation. The blast wave expanded outward and damaged two nearby vessels, cracking their hulls and sending them tumbling. Then the second vehicle hit, then the third, then dozens at once coming from different angles, crossing the formation in streaks of light that were visible for only a fraction of a second before they struck. The Vreth fleet came apart. Ships died so fast that the tactical display could not update quickly enough to track them. Red dots vanished by the dozens, then by the scores. Explosions overlapped, creating chain reactions as debris from destroyed ships struck their neighbors. The formation, already loose and ragged from the retreat, dissolved into chaos. Ships scattered in all directions, trying desperately to evade the rain of death that was falling on them from every part of the sky. There was no hiding from it. The projectiles came from above, below, ahead, behind, from angles that no formation could protect against. They were not aimed at specific ships. They were aimed at the space the fleet occupied, a volume of destruction that swallowed everything within it. Some ships survived the first wave. They were the lucky ones, the ones that happened to be at the edges of the formation when the impacts began. They fired their engines and ran, scattering in every direction. But the Fenrir launch had included a second wave, timed to arrive 4 minutes after the first, targeted at the predicted scatter pattern. The second wave caught the runners. Zarak's flagship, the Throne of Silence, was at the center of the formation when the first wave hit. The ship's shields deflected the blast wave from a nearby impact, but the energy surge overloaded 3 shield generators and set fire to the port weapons deck. Damage reports flooded in from every section. The ship was dying, but it was still there. Then a Fenrir vehicle struck the Throne of Silence directly. It hit the aft section, where the main engines were housed. The impact tore the back third of the ship away and sent the remaining hull spinning. The bridge lost power. Emergency lights flickered on, painting everything in a dim red glow. Gravity generators failed, and everyone on the bridge was suddenly floating, grabbing at consoles and railings to keep from drifting. Zarak held onto his command chair with 3 hands. His fourth arm, the broken one, hung useless at his side. Blood from a cut on his head drifted in small red spheres around his face. The bridge was filled with the sounds of alarms, of metal groaning, of the ship slowly tearing itself apart. "Damage report," he said. His voice was still calm. Even now, even at the end, his voice was calm. "Engines are gone. Grand Admiral. Reactor is failing. Hull integrity is at 12%. We have no weapons, no shields, no propulsion. Life support will fail in approximately 20 minutes. Zarak nodded. He looked around the bridge one more time. Tulloch was there, strapped into his station, alive but bleeding. The sensor officer was unconscious, floating limply near the ceiling. Several officers were dead, killed by flying debris or explosive decompression. "How many ships remain?" Zarak asked. There was a long silence. Then the communications officer, working from a backup console, answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "Grand Admiral, I am detecting fewer than 50 Vreth ships still transmitting. Most appear heavily damaged. I cannot confirm combat capability for any of them." 50. Out of 4,200. Zarak closed his eyes. Behind his dark eyelids, he saw them all. Every ship, every crew member, every warrior who had followed him into this system with absolute confidence that they would return victorious. Over 1 million Vreth lives gone. The greatest military force the Dominion had ever assembled, destroyed by a species that the intelligence reports had classified as primitive. He opened his eyes and looked at the communications officer. "Is the long-range transmitter functional? I can try to route through the backup array, Grand Admiral. It may work." "Do it. I have a final message for High Command." It took several minutes. The ship groaned and shuddered around them. A section of the outer hull detached and spun away into space. The temperature on the bridge was dropping. Zarak could see his breath forming crystals in the air. The communications officer looked up. "Channel open, Grand Admiral. Signal is weak, but it should reach Dominion relay stations." Zarak pulled himself into a proper position, straightening his back despite the pain, facing the communication array as though he were standing before the Dominion Council itself. When he spoke, his voice was clear. "This is Grand Admiral Zarak, commanding the Throne of Silence. This message is for Dominion High Command. Priority absolute." He paused. The words came not from duty or obligation, but from something deeper. Something that a Vreth commander was not supposed to feel. Honesty. "The invasion fleet has been destroyed. Of 4,200 warships, fewer than 50 remain, all critically damaged. The target species, designated human, it possesses military capabilities that exceed our own in every measurable category. Their weapons are beyond anything in the Dominion's experience. Their tactics are adaptive, creative, and ruthless. Their will to fight is absolute." He paused again. The ship shuddered. Something deep in the hull gave way with a metallic scream. "I have made errors of judgment in this campaign. I underestimated the enemy. I relied on intelligence that was catastrophically wrong. But I do not believe any commander could have achieved a different result. The humans were prepared for us. They have been preparing for decades. They knew we were coming, and they built weapons specifically designed to destroy us." The lights on the bridge flickered. The emergency power was failing. "My final recommendation to High Command is this. Do not send another fleet. Do not send reinforcements. Do not attempt to avenge this defeat. The humans are not prey. They were never prey. We made the oldest mistake in warfare. We assumed that because a species had not ventured beyond its own system, it was weak. We were wrong. They stayed in their system because they were busy turning it into a fortress." The ship lurched. Tollick called out that the reactor containment was about to fail. They had minutes, perhaps less. Zarak leaned forward, his dark eyes burning with a fire that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the terrible clarity of a being who finally understood the truth. "Do not come here. Do not send anyone here. They were never prey. We were." He closed the channel. The communication officer confirmed that the message had been transmitted. Zarak thanked him. Then he thanked Tollick, and on every officer still alive on the bridge, one by one. It was not a Vreth custom. Vreth commanders did not thank their subordinates, but Zarak was no longer interested in custom. The reactor failed 3 minutes later. The Throne of Silence, flagship of the Vreth Dominion's invasion fleet, the ship that had led the conquest of 100 worlds, broke apart in a final, silent explosion that lit up the darkness for a brief moment and then faded to nothing. Grand Admiral Zarak the Unbroken died in the dark, between two worlds that would never know his name. 6 months later on Earth, the world was different. The war had lasted less than 2 weeks from first detection to last shot. In that time, humanity had destroyed the most powerful military force ever sent against a single planet. The cost had been terrible. Thousands of soldiers and sailors were dead. Over 60 warships were lost. The Mars colonies had endured hours of terror that would leave psychological scars for a generation. Admiral Yuki Tanaka and her crew were gone. But humanity was alive. Earth was safe. Mars was rebuilding, and the galaxy was paying attention. Voronov stood before the United Nations General Assembly on a gray Tuesday morning in Geneva. He was old and tired. The war had aged him in ways that went beyond the physical. He moved slowly to the podium and looked out at the assembled leaders of every nation on Earth. 6 months ago, he began, we fought for our survival. Today, I stand before you not to celebrate, but to remember the people we lost, to remember the cost of what we did. He spoke of Tanaka. He spoke of the crew of the Defiance. He spoke of the drone operators who guided swarms into battle, knowing that every target they destroyed was a ship full of living beings. He spoke of the Mars colonists who sat in the dark and the cold while the sky burned above them. He spoke of Priya Menon, the young lieutenant who had been the first to see the enemy coming. He did not speak of glory. He did not speak of triumph. He spoke of fear, of sacrifice, of the terrible things that ordinary people had done because they had no other choice. Then he changed his tone. We have intercepted Vreth long-range communications over the past months. The message sent by their commander before his death has been received by the Dominion, and it is spreading. Not just within the Dominion, but beyond it. Other species that the Vreth conquered and enslaved long ago, could have heard what happened here. They have heard that a single species on a single world broke the greatest fleet the Dominion ever built. He looked out at the assembly. They are beginning to resist. On 7 worlds that we know of, subject species have risen up against their Vreth occupiers. The revolts are small, they are fragile, but they are happening because of what we did here, because we showed the galaxy that the Vreth can be beaten. The assembly was silent. Every leader, every diplomat, every translator in the room was listening. We have a choice to make now. We can seal our borders. We can build our defenses even higher and hide behind them. We can be safe and we can be alone. Or we can do something that no species in this part of the galaxy has done for 10,000 years. We can reach out. We can find the species that the Vreth have crushed. We can give them the weapons, the knowledge, and the hope they need to free themselves. He placed his hands on the podium. I am not a politician. I am a soldier. I do not know how to build alliances or negotiate treaties. But I know this. We did not fight this war to be safe. We fought it to be free. And freedom that exists only for us while others suffer is not freedom at all. It is cowardice. He straightened his back, and for a moment he looked like the young officer he had once been, full of fire and certainty. I recommend that this assembly authorize the creation of a galactic outreach program. We will build ships capable of reaching other star systems. We will find the Tellari's homeworld and honor their memory. We will find every species the Vreth have broken, and we will help them stand up. He paused. Then he spoke the words that would be broadcast intentionally on every frequency humanity could project into the stars. Words that would be picked up by Vreth listening posts, by the sensors of subject species, by anyone in the galaxy with the ability to hear. We did not seek this war. We will not seek the next. But let every empire, every dominion, every throne that looks upon the stars and sees only subjects hear this. Earth is not alone in its defiance, and we remember every species you broke. We are coming, not as conquerors, but as liberators, and we do not stop. The assembly erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. A sound that was part determination and part relief, and part the raw, overwhelming emotion of a species that had stared into the abyss and refused to fall. The vote to authorize the Galactic Outreach Program was not unanimous. It was close, and it was messy, and it was full of arguments and compromises. It passed. On Mars, Governor Diallo lit a memorial flame on the summit of Olympus Mons. The flame was powered by a fusion cell that would burn for 1,000 years. A simple plaque at its base read, "For Yuki, Tanaka, and all who held the line, Mars remembers." 2 million colonists watched the lighting ceremony from their underground cities projected on the screens that served as their windows to the surface. When the flame ignited, they cheered so loud that the sound echoed through the tunnels and made the walls hum. In the weeks that followed, humanity began to build. New shipyards, new weapons, new technologies based on what they had learned from the war. But also new things that had nothing to do with war. Communication arrays designed to send messages to distant stars. Translation algorithms built from the Tellari language data. Diplomatic protocols for first contact with species they had never met. Humanity reached outward, not with weapons, but with open hands. Though the weapons were there too, just in case. Humans were optimists, but they were not fools. And on a world 17 light-years from Earth, in a place that humans did not yet know existed, something remarkable was happening. The species was called the Morith. They were small, quiet beings with large eyes adapted to the dim light of their underground warrens. The Vreth had conquered them 400 years ago. Generations of Morith had lived and died under Vreth rule, knowing nothing else. They mined ore. They built components. They served. Resistance was a word that existed only in old stories, told in whispers. But now there was a new story. It had come through the Vreth communication networks, passed from relay to relay across the stars. The Vreth tried to suppress it, but information has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. The Morath heard it in fragments, pieced together from intercepted transmissions and whispered reports from Morath who worked in Vreth communication centers. A species called human, a world called Earth, a fleet of 4,000 ships, destroyed. A Grand Admiral killed. An empire shaken. In a small warren beneath the surface of the Morath homeworld, a group of Morath gathered around a crude radio receiver that they had built in secret from stolen parts. They huddled close, their large eyes reflecting the dim glow of the device. The signal was weak, translated through 3 different alien languages before reaching Morath ears, distorted and crackling. But the words were clear. "We are coming, not as conquerors but as liberators, and we do not stop." The Morath looked at each other. For 400 years they had looked down, at the ground, at their chains, at the darkness that was all they had ever known. Now, for the first time in generations, they looked up. Not in fear, in hope. And in the darkness of their small hidden room, beneath the surface of a conquered world, the oldest Morath in the group did something that nobody had seen a Morath do in living memory. She smiled.